Hello, everyone. Hopefully, this thing actually has started recording. And welcome back to another wonderful week of World Civilizations 1, online, of course. This week, we're going to start wrapping up the semester by looking at the Black Death and its impact upon the world during and after its spread throughout the international community. So, we'll jump right into it by getting into the key terms for today. We're actually going to define a little bit more specifically what the plague actually is. We'll define the Little Ice Age and its role in the Black Plague. We'll look at the outbreak in Messina, Sicily in 1347. We'll look at the Red Turban movement in China. And we'll look at some of the various Black Death Christian movements that sprung up in opposition, or at least as an alternative, to Roman Catholicism. But in the meantime, I of course want to make sure you're aware of all important upcoming dates. Our second debate is scheduled for December the 11th at 5 p.m. Our last content quiz is scheduled for December 14th at 5 p.m. And your final essay will be due on December 16th, once again, of course, at 5 p.m. Now, you might have noticed that I went pretty quickly through these descriptions because I think we all pretty much know how these assignments are posted and submitted at this point, but still feel free if you have any questions to run them by me as soon as you possibly can. I am rushing through the descriptions a little bit in the interest of time, but that doesn't mean I'm not willing to still hear your questions. One thing I will say is that I will be sending out a team and time sign-up sheet for debate 2, posting that to Blackboard by tomorrow at the very latest. Which, by the way, I'm filming this on the Sunday before class is going to start back up, so you should be viewing this on Monday at some point, or around Monday. So by Monday, which is, let's do my math, November the 30th, you should have received a sign-up sheet for our second debate. But in the meantime, let's jump right into the thick of things and look at the causes of the Black Plague, sort of brainstorm that a little bit. What I'm going to do is, just because I'm a wonderful person, I'm giving you another link to a scene from Monty Python, this time showing an actually fairly historically accurate depiction, despite all the comedy, of a body collector during the worst years of the Black Death. What I'd like you to do is to, again, sort of look through and see what I can maybe reveal about the accuracy of the Dark Ages and the Black Plague. So, look at the conditions and the environment people are in, and think about why the Black Plague might have been so deadly at this point. Also, try to look at maybe what made the Black Plague so terrifying, and if you feel like it, which you should hopefully feel like it, think about whether we should call this period the Dark Ages or the Late Antiquity period. Because if you remember, we debated that a couple of weeks ago. So again, you should pause this video at this point, watch this scene from Monty Python, and be prepared to discuss these questions here. Anyway, I'm going to assume you've gone ahead and done that. Let's move on. So, like I said, we are going to more specifically define the Black Plague. The plague is actually a separate category of disease, which I feel like a lot of us don't actually know. I didn't actually know that, because we a lot of times will use plague just for any worldwide disease that has a high death toll and spreads very quickly. But technically, plague is actually its own disease. The bubonic plague that we're most familiar with is actually just one strain of the plague, and was most common during these years we're studying today. However, there is also a septimemic form of the plague, which I'm pretty sure I pronounced that wrong. There is also a pneumonic version of the plague. What these diseases all have in common is that they come from the bacteria Yersinia pestis, which is where we get the term pestilence from, obviously, if you didn't figure that out. But yes, the plague is actually one kind of disease, and has actually sprung up since the years of the Black Plague, just not the bubonic strain that was the most deadly. Anyway, to give you a little bit of an idea of what the plague was like. The symptoms include a fever, of course, which ranges typically from 100 to 106 degrees. You would get headaches, painful and aching joints, nausea and vomiting, and the most identifiable symptom, buboes, or the inflammation of the lymph nodes. This included, these would show up on the groin, neck, and armpits, so obviously in very inconvenient and unpleasant places. Now, what do you think happened when someone started showing these symptoms, based on the video we just saw, for example? Very good. Once again, audience watching at home. As you can probably guess from this picture, this became one of the most identifiable, as I said, symptoms of the Black Plague, and it was pretty much a universal sign that you were coming down with the Black Death. As the video implied, and as we'll see in some other examples going throughout this class, This often led to mass panic and the abandonment of people showing symptoms. People oftentimes didn't want to stick around in a place that was hit by the Black Death, and the identification of this symptom in particular played a role in that. Finally, in the later stages, you would often just start vomiting up blood until you died. So, obviously, not a very great death. Now, the peak years of this plague were from 1347 to 1351, which are the years we'll be focusing on primarily today, especially in Europe. Now, just to give you a big picture of the impact of the Black Death before we start going region by region. Excuse me. The total deaths are very difficult to estimate, but they roughly ranged from about 75 to 200 million. The Philip DeLater from the College of William and Mary and a historian estimates that the European death rate over those peak years, again, 47 to 51, was 45 to 50%. Historians like old Benedictau, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, estimate that the death rate could have been as high as 60% in Europe. Again, humongous death toll across the board. A little bit more individual. In Paris, it's estimated that 50,000 out of the 100,000 population city died. In Florence, Italy, it's estimated that 70,000 out of 120,000 died. It is estimated that there was a 60% death count in the cities of Hamburg, Bremen, and London, with London having about 62,000 dead. In the Middle East, it is estimated that across the board, there was about a 1/3 death rate average. And in Egypt alone, there was a 40% death rate, with Cairo, the city of Cairo, having 40% of their population die just within 8 months. So again, just now that you know a little bit more about the overall impact of the Black Death, maybe you can explain. It's easier to explain some of this art that you typically see coming from the Black Death time period, particularly in Europe. Why do you think they would have this type of art during this time? Very good. Once again, students at home, that one is, of course, pretty self-explanatory. Many people were, of course, preoccupied with death, since so many people that you know are going to be dying because of this Black Death's humongous death toll. So art that you see during the Black Death period usually revolves around this: massive armies of skeletons, mass graves, huge massacres. Essentially, everything is just preoccupied with death. As we're going to see a little bit later, pretty much all religious belief thought around this time that the world could potentially be coming to an end. So you're going to see a lot of death-centered and apocalyptic art during this time period. In the meantime, moving on. Now we're going to get into a little bit more of the specifics of the impacts of the Black Plague. To give you a better idea of what it was like, I found an excerpt from an account from Agnolo di Tura, who was an Italian shoemaker and tax collector, and gave one of the most famous descriptions of the impact of the Black Death after he lost his wife and all 5 of his children during the Black Plague. In May 1348, he wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife, husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight, and so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices. Great pits were dug and piled deep with the multitude of dead, and they died by the hundreds both day and night. And as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug. And I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands. And there were also those who were so sparsely covered with earth that the dogs dragged them forth and devoured many bodies throughout the city. There was no one who wept for any death, for all awaited death. And so many died that all believed it was the end of the world." So, now we've gone through that huge spiel of how horrible this event was. Can anyone tell me how the Black Plague is going to impact the world, maybe culturally, economically, and politically? I'm learning what to do during these awkward pauses, finally, maybe. But yeah, let's focus on culturally for a second, particularly upon religion. How do you think people are going to react to religious leaders during this time period? Probably not very great. Excellent work. As you can see here, when people are bringing their loved ones to die, there are no priests or divine offices there to give them any assistance or to give them any comfort. As you might imagine, that's going to lead to a loss of respect and faith in religion during this time period. Economically, as you might imagine, the world economy is going to go south as well. Literally, people are dying so much that there really isn't much of anyone left to produce anything or to trade, which we'll talk about more specifically in a second, but also politically. what do you guys know maybe about what nobles did during this time period? Very good. Again, a lot of times they often would abandon their peasants and flee to the countryside to try to avoid the Black Death. So a lot of people felt abandoned by their political leaders as well. For example, some of you may not know this, but it is actually recorded that the Pope during this time period, who essentially is a political and religious figure, would seclude himself and have a constant fire in between him and anyone who came to have an audience. So a lot of people felt abandoned essentially during this time period, which is going to lead to a bit of a shakeup we'll talk about in the next lesson. But in the meantime, I do want to talk a little bit about the climate and the Black Death. One of the climate reasons historians and climatologists have identified for the severity of the Black Death is the Little Ice Age, which lasted from about 1300 to 1870. This is a period where you saw a lot of cold winters throughout Europe and North America. For example, by 1310, there were shortened growing seasons all across Europe and harvests, and there was a great famine in 1315 to 1322, which was again caused by these declining harvests, but also because nobles started trying to hoard the food they could get for themselves. Now, why would these things make the Black Death even more dangerous? Very good. Once again, students watching at home, I'm assuming this was very easy for those of you who are into health and nutrition in this class, for example. Obviously, if you're already malnourished, that's going to make you more vulnerable and your immunity system less effective against any disease that comes rolling in. So essentially, the European people were already prepared for this plague negatively. Yes, just saying they're prepared doesn't make sense. But they were already pretty much vulnerable to this plague. That's better, because their immune systems and health had already declined because of this famine. Also, the drying of the Asian steppe borderlands, or some of Central Asia near Europe, also helped cause this plague, people have argued, because of the forced migration of Asian rodents and the fleas that the rodents carried, which already were carrying the plague. So essentially they're being migrated and taking the plague to places that aren't used to them, unlike the Asian borderlands where it had already existed. Anyway, trade, of course, is considered to be, as you might have guessed, is considered to be the primarily responsible for transmitting the Black Death across the world. We've talked quite a bit about how trade was becoming more and more international in this time period, which means the Black Death had easy access to huge portions of the world. Now, why are these new populations going to be more vulnerable to the Black Death? Very good. Again, students watching at home, immunity systems. It took me a second to get it. Yeah, if you've already had the plague, you're of course going to be more prepared to survive it. But these international trade routes are taking diseases to places they've never existed before. The first known major outbreak occurred in the 1320s in China, which was able to transmit to the rest of the world, again because of those trade routes we talked about. But specifically, the Mongols had revived trade, like we talked about a little bit last week, along the Silk Roads. So the Silk Roads had let the disease have easy access to the rest of the world. The first time this disease hit Europe in 1347, which is considered again to be the start of the peak years, was in Messina, Sicily. 12 trading ships had come in from the Black Sea, and when they came onto the ships, most of the crew was dead, and all the survivors were covered in these black boils. So again, very deadly disease brought in by trade. This, as you might imagine, led to a decline in world trade across the board, not just because people were dying so fast, but because people were losing faith in trade and didn't want to risk bringing in a disease if they thought they could be disease-free. So again, trade, of course, played a big role in the Black Death. Now, again, getting even more specific, we're going to look at the Black Death in China for a little bit. By the 1350s, the Black Death had resulted in the Mongols losing their claim to the Mandate of Heaven. Now, why would you think they lost the Mandate of Heaven during this time? Very good. Once again, those of you who remember what the Mandate of Heaven is, the Mandate of Heaven is essentially the same thing as a European divine right to rule. It's the belief that a dynasty is ruling the China because heaven gives them the right to do so. As you might remember, this was based upon the idea that the rulers had to uphold their responsibility to protect and help the Chinese people. Having something like this occur, For example, in 1331, where it's estimated that the Black Death killed 90% of the population in the Bizili province alone, would make you lose confidence in rulers having that divine right. So essentially, this directly caused the Mongols to lose control of their territory in China. In response, the Red Turban movement rebellion sprung up. This is a doomsday movement of blended Buddhism and Taoism traditions, which overthrew the Mongols in 1368. They emphasized dietary restrictions, penance, and elaborate ceremonial rituals, and they proclaimed that the world was coming to an end. Now, why would a group like this have so much appeal at this point? Very good. Once again, students watching at home, especially those of you who were paying attention earlier. Remember, Agnola di Turo told us that so many people were dying that all believed it was the end of the world. This was a fairly universal belief in places that were affected by the Black Death. So when all these people believe that it is going to be the end of the world, they're going to be more open to more quote-unquote radical and doomsday predicting religious movements. Things like this spring up all the time. For example, many Christians in America became more drawn to Christian denominations that proclaim things like the day that Christ is coming back soon, the tribulation might already be happening during the Dust Bowl in America. So again, very common that when tragedies are happening, people get drawn to more maybe extreme, not that that's necessarily even a bad thing, religion is none of my business, but more like doomsday or from end of the world focused religious movements. Anyway, now we'll go into the Black Death in Arabia just a bit. It did, of course, after going through Asia, the Black Death would arrive first in the Middle East. It is estimated that the Black Death reached Baghdad by 1347, and in just the next year went throughout Egypt, Syria, and Cyprus. The plague was so deadly that it was estimated that there were 1,000 deaths per day in the first year of the spread across the Middle East. And according to Ibn Khaldun, an Arab historian who lived from 1332 to 1406, cities and buildings were laid to waste, roads and waystlines were obliterated, settlements and mansions became empty, dynasties and tribes grew weak, the entire world changed. So again, what does this quote suggest is going to happen to the international community in the world? Very good. Once again, students watching at home, we can especially focus on the political implications of this Black Plague. Dynasties and tribes and various other groups are starting to become much weaker across the board. So essentially, again, new political groups and new nations are going to have to spring up to keep authority in the wake of the Black Death. Now, let's jump into Europe. From 1347 to 1351, in those peak years, the plague started off reaching Italy, then went to France, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Germany, and England. It is estimated, or at least the highest estimate is that 50 million out of Europe's 80 million people died. So again, could be a very high death count. The plague returned roughly every 7 years throughout the 15th century, which of course would devastate the population even further, to the point that by 1450, the European population was only a quarter of what it had been in 1350. So again, one of the only events in world history that has left a noticeable percentage gap in the world's population. Huge death count across the board. Now, jumping into how the Black Death affected European religion. Throughout the Black Death's presence in Europe, many religious organizations sprang up independently of the Catholic Church. Why do you think that's the case? Once again, very good. Students watching at home, I already kind of went over this one pretty earlier, so I won't give you too much of a pause. Many people felt abandoned by the Catholic Church, or that they weren't doing their duty to protect them and get them in God's good graces. So many other groups try to come up with their own religious explanations for what was happening. For example, the Beggars and the Beguines became popular across Europe. These were semi-monastic orders who preached that the people should trust their own interior instinct about God, instead of the gospel as preached by the Pope and priests. Why would this in particular be such a threat to Catholicism? Very good. Once again, students watching at home, this is a topic we've talked about quite a bit throughout this course. Like many other religious organizations and priestly groups throughout history, the Catholic Church and their priests essentially kept their authority and power by being the ones who are interpreting God's word and preaching the gospel to people. If people are now starting to believe that they can do that on their own, no one's really going to need the Catholic Church around anymore, which would be a huge hit to their authority. One of the more extreme examples of these groups were the flagellants, who you can see depicted here, who would whip themselves to atone for their sin and to try to protect themselves from God's wrath. So again, very diverse and extreme religious groups sprang up in response to this Black Death. By 1372, Pope Gregory XI had declared all three of these groups to be heretical and urged his followers to eradicate them, which again shows how much of a threat the Catholic Church considered these groups to be to their authority. Anyway, to start wrapping things up, we'll look again at the death of the old world and how exactly the world is going to recover from this. A few things the monarchs and leaders try to do after the Black Death to restore their legitimacy. First, you're going to once again claim a mandate of heaven or divine right. That one's pretty straightforward, but it also became more important to establish clear rules of secession in your government. Now, especially during the Black Death or right after the Black Death, why would that be so important for you to keep your authority? Very good, particularly during the having a clear line of secession is just a good way to keep your government stable at any point. Remember, for example, when we talked about Alexander the Great. He was great at conquering and kind of taking over territories, but since he gave no clear idea for who should rule his entire empire after he died, his followers and advisors immediately split up and started fighting over it after he died. But during the Black Death, this is going to be even more important. For example, the reason I put this presidential order of secession up here is to show you how detailed the order of secession actually is if anything happens to the president. We literally have a plan for who will be president if, 15 people or more in the line of secession actually die. During the Black Death, when huge portions of the population and entire families could be potentially wiped out, it's very important to have a clear rule of secession that's very detailed, so there's always someone in this royal family who is believed to have the divine right to rule, who can take over and rule your government. So, very important obviously in a Black Death world. Also, they would expand power through conquest and royal marriages. So this is also when you start seeing these European royal families become increasingly intermarried and frankly have a lot of inbreeding and a lot of family marriages and things like that, which we will talk a bit more about in the next lesson. But again, in the meantime, that's about all I have for you. I would just like you to go ahead and start planning for your debate a little bit. Because if you remember, you guys are going to be debating whether or not the Black Death could ever be justified as a positive event. Think of multiple perspectives and try to get a little bit prepared ahead of time. Like I said, by the time you see this PowerPoint, you should be able to go ahead and pick your team, so you should be prepared to argue from one side or the other. But anyway, that's all I have. Just again, please remember our upcoming dates, and have a great rest of your week. Adios.